Yeah, I'm Chase Walker. I'm out of Buffalo, New York. I'm a formerly incarcerated activist. I protested injustices in the county jail out here. There was a riot and prisoners were mistreated and beaten and treated inhumanely. I protested and performed a hunger strike, and I ended up being hospitalized. I also want to thank Melanie and Pat for participating in this forum and just asking all the tough questions and pushing for opportunities and programming in prison because it's much needed. But yeah, there are some things I disagree with. Obviously, was it Nate stated that the solitary confinement isn't really solitary. You pretty much covered that, how you minimalize it.
Yeah.
And I found that interesting because I've been in the shoe. You're in a cell by yourself, and that's like equivalent to saying that just because there's a whole lot of dead bodies in the cemetery, you're not in the casket alone. Like, it doesn't matter what surrounds you. You can't minimalize it. It's been considered torture under international standards. And I noticed the speaking position he has as a former CEO is just that he's the letter of the law and everyone has to be
Mhm.
punished for not obeying the rules. And when you speak of justice, you're speaking about justice, equality, fairness, accountability, and transparency. And these are all things that, unfortunately, officers are incapable of showing at this time. They're not willing to wear body cams. They're not willing to fill out paperwork properly. And another interesting thing I noticed when Pat mentioned the body cams, Nate
Mhm.
stated that Great Meadow has always had cameras prior to the body cams. But what they didn't mention was the history because there was a whole lot of publications of abuses of power and excessive force. That's how there was initially surveillance in the prisons. And once that came, the officers adjusted and they found the blind spots and they'll take you off camera and
Wow.
beat you and mistreat you in the blind spots in the facility. And the reaction to that, advocates, they pushed away for body cams and they got hip to that game and started to leave their body cams off so they wouldn't have any visual evidence of the brutality. And there was an adaptation to that, which was the what's it called, the standby mode. And now we've
Mhm.
actually caught them in the murder of Robert Brooks. So we've reached a critical point where there's nowhere left to hide. So they can't take this standpoint of moral superiority in their argument and always bring up the rule of the law because law requires transparency and accountability and equality.
Yes.
It has to be treated fairly across all planes, to prisoners and officers. And and like you said, you mentioned it, they constantly talk about how prisoners, there's no deterrent to violence and it's unsafe for officers. And you don't hear you never heard of a prisoner getting away with assaulting an officer. That's unheard of. Even for minor infractions, we're made accountable for offenses we haven't committed. There's no due process. When you go to a disciplinary hearing, it's just the word of the officer, and you're going amongst his fellow officers, and you're going to get time in the shoe. It's pretty much a guarantee. So when they talk about accountability and not having the ability to discipline people for different misconduct, it's a mute point. Like you said, they're looking for the
Yeah.
boogeyman or a scapegoat, which happens to be conveniently Hawk. So, like I said, I'm familiar with everything. I exhausted my remedies. I've contacted all the way to the governor's office. I filed grievances and appeal to the commission corrections, and it goes back to the culture of violence. No one's willing to hold each other accountable on their side. So that's the root, is that blue wall of silence. So until they actually stand away from those who are continuing to brutalize and abuse their power, it's going to continue. Because, like I said, they're just going to try to gloss over it and feign sympathy and say they want justice and they don't stand with the officer that committed murder in Marcy. But until they actually separate themselves, it's going to
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people think body cams by itself is the answer, right? But we
Mhm.
have to understand this, that those officers had body cams, four of them happened to be on standby mode, right?
Right.
But we know that there are no consequences for turning off your body cam. So you can mandate officers to have their body cams on, but if they don't have it on, there's no consequences for that because you have officers that are beating and murdering those incarcerated who keep their jobs. So not having a camera on, I don't think it's gonna, uh, someone will not lose their job over that. If someone doesn't lose their job over sending somebody into intensive care, they will not lose their job for not having a body cam on. So you had mentioned being in SHU. What was the longest amount of time you were ever in solitary confinement?
I was in solitary confinement for 150 days. That's what I was performing my hunger strike. I was initially given, I want to say 60 days. And when I refused to go to medical unit because they tried to force medical treatment on me, and you have to get a judicial subpoena in order to give me an IV. So on day 47, I refused medical treatment. They forced me against my will into the medical unit. They called a response team and beat me, slammed my head against the wall repeatedly, and they gave me a ticket for refusing to move. So because I exercised my right to refuse medical treatment and a hunger strike is protected under free speech, they decided to give me a ticket and give me more time in the box. So I
Mm,
wrote grievances because the law had just changed where there was a maximum time you could be in the SHU in New York State due to the effects it has on our mental health. And they denied my grievance. I appealed it all the way outside of the jail to the Commission of Corrections in Albany, and they claimed they investigated and saw no harm was done. So a lot of my rights were violated, and I realized just the nature of this beast. Even getting outside of the jail, no one cares.
yeah. Wow. Wow. So you mentioned, going on a hunger strike. What precipitated the hunger strike? What was happening before that made you go on a strike?
Yeah, this was during the pandemic, so we weren't. This was in 2021. We weren't getting any visits from the outside, only virtual visits, and
Mm,
they stopped our incoming mail. So they were actually making Xeroxes of our mail. So people were getting black and white photocopies of their child's photos. They had took some of the privileges like a microwave, and we were being locked in our cells illegally 24 hours a day and being denied showers. So several inmates decided to talk to the staff about the conditions. They didn't want to enter in discussions. And so, in a band of solidarity, black, white, and brown prisoners refused to lock in their cells
mm,
and demand discussions from the administration. What happened was they refused to talk, they abandoned the unit, and the prisoners locked them out of the unit. And eventually, there was some, they called it a riot. There was some property that was destroyed. No prisoners harmed each other, and they went back into the cell on their own accord. But in response, the staff, they pulled who they called to be the most unruly. They beat them. They sprayed them with water and turned the AC up. They starved them, and they just gave them horrific conditions. So that's what triggered my response because I saw every attempt we made to speak with them, they would just weaponize it against us. So I figured a peaceful protest in the form of a hunger strike, they wouldn't be able to use that against me. But unfortunately, I realized they said I threatened to kill staff, and they decided, well, okay, we have a loophole. We can't force you to get medical treatment because if they did a judicial subpoena, it would bring outside attention to the hunger strike and the reason why I was protesting. So they decided that they were going to move my housing status to the medical unit, and they had the response team beat me and strap me in a chair and drag me to the medical unit. Uh, I broke the hunger strike after 60 days when I was transferred to the local hospital, when I lost 60 pounds and had severe dehydration, but they didn't contact my family. They were listed as emergency contact. My family was blowing the jail up, calling. They refused to tell them about my safety and the condition I was in. So, and they also misdiagnosed me intentionally with two mental health conditions just to repress my voice. So there was a lot done to keep me silent and bury
mm.
all of their misconduct.
Wow. So how are you now in terms of like your mental health and your advocacy? Like, how are you feeling now about all this after the fact?
Um, it's a day-to-day thing. Of course, I hold some resentment. I'm working on it, trying to get past it. What really stings most is the fact that my family contacted Governor Hochul's office. They said they'd send somebody to look into it. Nobody looked into it, and they have free reign to continue to mistreat and beat other prisoners. So that's what hurts the most, knowing that there's no accountability. I've got all the paper trail, all my receipts. I've contacted everybody who are in these oversight positions, and nobody did what their job is. So that was the most challenging and still disappointing factor, that the people who are paid to hold these institutions accountable refuse to do it.
Wow. And a question for you: Do you think the family of Robert Brooks will see justice?
Honestly, I don't have much faith in the judicial system. I think these charges were filed just because something had to be done, because the abuse was so egregious. It was literally murder. They falsified records. It's going to be a long, drawn out process, but we're going to see. I'm going to pay close attention and follow the trial and see what evidence is brought forward. It's interesting to see what defense will be prepared. And also, these officers, some of them are mentioned in the Day of Terror in Mid-State. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah,
So
I
we're
am.
going to see the history of their abuse. We're going to see that there's long allegations of what they've done. So you can see their mind state. I don't see how they can avoid a guilty verdict, but nothing really surprises me at this point.
If you found value in this video, please like the video, comment below. Don't forget to share the video. And if you feel that I've earned it, please subscribe to the channel. My goal is to give you honest and direct feedback and go deeper than what the mainstream media is telling you. Take care, God bless, and see you next time.